The wind did not howl. It shrieked. It was a physical weight, a moving wall of white that erased the horizon and swallowed the sky. Snow blew horizontally sharp as ground glass scouring the frozen earth. There was no sun, only a pale, bruised gray that offered no warmth and no direction. He walked ahead of the gelding. He held the frozen leather reins over his shoulder, leaning his weight forward into the gale. His boots broke through the crust of the snow with a heavy rhythmic crunch, leaving deep holes that the wind filled in seconds. His canvas duster, stiff with ice, cracked with every step. The wide brim of his hat was pulled low, almost touching the thick woolen scarf wrapped around the lower half of his face. Ice crystals clung to his eyelashes, freezing his vision into narrow, blurry slits. Behind him, the horse dragged its hooves. The beast's head hung low, its breath pluming in short, ragged bursts that instantly turned to frost on its dark muzzle. The animal's coat was matted with ice, and a tremor ran through its heavy shoulders with every step. He stopped. He did not look back, but he felt the dead weight on the reins. He pulled a slow, steady pressure. The horse did not move. He turned. He moved back to the animal, his boots dragging through the drifts. He raised a heavy leather-gloved hand and rested it on the horse's neck. The muscle beneath the frozen coat was hard and vibrating. He stood there for a long moment, letting his body act as a windbreak for the animal. He did not speak. Words would freeze in the air, a waste of breath. He simply pressed his forehead against the horse's jaw. He stepped back, taking the reins again. He wrapped the stiff leather around his wrist. He turned his back to the horse and leaned into the wind. He stepped forward. The reins pulled taut. He kept the pressure constant. A step, another step, a groan of leather. The horse moved. They continued. Time lost its shape. There was only the white void, the burning in his lungs, and the dull rhythmic thud of his heart. The cold had long ago moved past the biting stage. His fingers were dead blocks of wood. His toes were gone. The blood moving through his veins felt thick and sluggish, like half-frozen molasses. The desire to simply lie down, to close his eyes and let the white noise take him, was a heavy, sweet blanket pulling at his mind. His right boot caught on something beneath the snow. He fell. He did not try to catch himself. His hands were too numb, his reactions too slow. He hit the snowbank shoulder first, his face burying into the freezing powder. The impact forced the little remaining air from his lungs. The reins slipped from his wrist. He lay there. The wind piled snow against his side, burying him, claiming him. The silence beneath the howling wind was immense. He pushed up. He forced his arms to bear his weight, his elbows trembling. He dragged his knees under him. He lifted his head, the snow falling from his hat brim. He reached blindly for the reins. His gloved hand swept through the snow. His knuckles scraped against something that was not ice, not rock. He paused. He pulled his hand back, staring at the patch of disturbed snow. He swept his arm across it again, harder this time. The snow cleared. Underneath was a flat surface, straight lines. He dropped back to his knees. He used both hands, digging with stiff mechanical movements. He pushed the snow aside, clearing a space the size of a saddle blanket. Wood. Heavy weathered planks bound together with iron straps. He stared at it. His chest heaved, pulling in the freezing air. He dragged his hands across the planks, feeling the grain, feeling the rivets. He moved his hands toward the edge of the wood, digging further. He found a recessed iron ring. It was thick with rust and frost. He wedged his numb fingers under the ring. He pulled. It did not budge. The ice had sealed the trapdoor shut. He leaned back on his heels. He unholstered the heavy revolver from his hip. The metal was brutally cold. He gripped it by the barrel. He brought the heavy steel butt of the grip down on the ice, crusting the edges of the wooden door. Crack. He hit it again, and again. The dull thuds were swallowed by the wind. He worked his way around the perimeter of the door, shattering the seal of ice. He holstered the gun. He grabbed the iron ring with both hands. He planted his boots on the planks, framing the door. He straightened his legs and pulled with his back, pulling with every last shred of strength left in his dying muscles. The hinges let out a harsh, metallic scream. The wood groaned. The ice snapped. The door lifted. He fell backward, hauling the heavy wooden square up until it slammed against the snowbank behind it. A square of absolute blackness gaped in the white earth. A rush of air hit his face. It was not cold. It carried the scent of damp earth, of burning wood, and something green. It smelled like impossible life. He rolled onto his stomach, crawling to the edge of the hole. A rough-hewn wooden ladder descended into the dark. Below, a faint, flickering orange glow painted the dirt walls. He looked back. The gelding stood a few paces away, a ghost in the storm, its head low. He stood. He walked to the horse. He gripped the halter, pulling the animal toward the opening. He brought the horse right to the edge of the descent. The warmth rising from the hole enveloped them both. The horse snorted a low, wet sound, its ears flicking forward. He reached to the saddle. He unbuckled his rifle scabbard and pulled it free. He checked the leather ties on his saddlebags. He untied his bedroll. He patted the horse's neck one last time, a firm, heavy strike of the palm against the frozen coat. He turned and stepped onto the first rung of the ladder. He began the long climb down into the earth, leaving the white hell above. The ladder groaned under his weight. The old pine rungs, bound with rusted wire, protested the sudden heavy intrusion. The shaft was narrow, a vertical tunnel carved through frozen topsoil and bedrock. He descended blindly. With each downward step, the wind's shriek dulled to a low, muffled hum. The air changed. The biting, razor-sharp frost gave way to a heavy, stagnant dampness. It pressed against his chilled skin, carrying a dense, complicated scent. His boots scraped against the rough-hewn wood. The rungs grew slick with condensation. His hands, still numb inside their stiff, ice-coated leather casings, slipped. He caught himself locking his elbows, relying on pure friction and the ache in his shoulders to keep from plummeting into the dark. He paused, pressing his cheek against the dirt wall of the shaft. The earth here was not frozen solid. It was merely cold, a precursor to the heat rising from below. The frost covering his canvas duster began to weep. Droplets of ice water snaked down his neck, sliding under his collar, sending sharp, stinging trails across his skin. His veins throbbed. The blood fought its way back into his half-dead extremities, bringing a fiery, prickling agony. His fingers felt as though they were being held to an open flame. He kept his jaw clamped tightly shut, breathing heavily through his nose, swallowing the groan rising in his throat. His heel met solid ground. It was not rock. It did not crack or crunch like the frozen tundra above. The surface yielded slightly under his weight. It was earth, soft, cultivated loam. He stepped entirely off the ladder. He stood in the gloom, closing his eyes for a long moment, letting his retinas adjust to the weak amber glow bleeding from a source further inside the cavern. Water dripped rapidly from the wide brim of his hat, pattering softly against his shoulders. He reached up with heavy, clumsy fingers and unraveled the stiff, ice-caked scarf from his lower face. The frozen wool scraped raw, wind-burned skin. He pulled in a deep, unobstructed breath. The scent hit him with the force of a physical blow. It was a bouquet that had absolutely no place in this white, dead wasteland. It was the sharp, peppery tang of tomato vines, the rich, heavy musk of wet soil and composting manure, the sweet, damp exhale of living, breathing vegetation, chlorophyll and damp roots. Underneath it all lingered the metallic bite of burning kerosene. It was the scent of a summer long dead buried deep and kept breathing by sheer, stubborn force of will. He blinked against the stinging sweat and melting ice. The cavern stretched out before him, vast and unnatural. Walls of packed dirt and heavy shoring timbers held back the crushing weight of the frozen prairie above. Between narrow, well-trodden walking paths, long wooden planter boxes sat in neat parallel lines, Thick, vibrant green leaves spilled over the rough pine boards. Stalks strained upward toward rows of polished tin sheets angled near several hurricane lanterns, catching and multiplying the meager yellow light. Fat, heavy tomatoes weighed down the vines. Stalks of corn brushed their dry tassels against the low dirt ceiling. He stood paralyzed by the impossible sight. The heavy rifle scabbard rested heavily against his hip. His frozen saddlebags hung from his left hand. The silence of the underground room was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic drip of melting ice from his coat and the strained, raspy pull of his own battered lungs. A sharp, metallic clack severed the heavy air. It was a sound etched into the marrow of his bones, a universal language spoken in dark alleys and open plains. The heavy hammer of a lever-action rifle locking back into place. He froze. He did not turn his head. He did not shift his weight. He stopped breathing. The sound had come from the deep shadows at the far end of the greenhouse beyond a dense row of tall cornstalks. A figure stepped out from the darkness. She moved without a sound, her boots silent on the soft, damp earth. She stepped into the very edge of the lantern light. The amber glow illuminated a long, heavy, octagonal barrel. The dark bore pointed directly at the center of his chest. Her hands were wrapped tightly around the scarred walnut stalk. Her knuckles were bone white, the skin pulled taut. She held the heavy weapon perfectly level, her left elbow tucked tight against her ribs for stability. There was not a single tremor in the steel. She wore a thick canvas work apron over a faded, patched woolen dress. The apron was stained with dark soil, green plant sap, and old grease. Her hair, the color of dry winter wheat, was pulled back harshly from her face, though stray strands clung to the sweat on her forehead. He watched her eyes. They were wide, catching the lantern light like polished river stones. They did not blink. They tracked the slow, ragged rise and fall of his chest. They drifted down to note the heavy Colt revolver strapped to his right thigh, the leather holster dark with melted snow. They noted the rifle scabbard he clutched. He felt the weight of the water soaking through his clothes. He felt the aching throb in his thawing fingers. The exhaustion held temporarily at bay by the adrenaline of the climb came crashing down on his shoulders like a cast-iron anvil. His legs trembled. He opened his hands. Slowly, deliberately. The thick leather saddlebags and the rifle scabbard slipped from his grip. They hit the soft earth with a muffled, heavy thud. The barrel of her rifle twitched, dropping a fraction of an inch toward the fallen bags before snapping right back to his chest. Her jaw tightened, a hard muscle popping beneath her ear. He raised his hands. He kept his elbows slightly bent, his palms facing her, his gloved fingers spread wide. The movements were glacial. He did not reach for his coat lapels. He did not brush the melting snow from his eyes. He stood with his arms raised, offering no resistance, a large surrendered target in the dim, humid light. The heavy canvas duster hung open, exposing the worn leather of his gun belt. He kept his hands high above the grip of the Colt. They stood separated by 30 feet of damp earth-green vines and total silence. The seconds stretched. The only movement was the slow crawl of a water droplet tracing the harsh line of his jaw, hanging for a brief moment on his graying stubble before falling to the dirt. He swallowed. His throat was dry as sand. He let out a long, ragged exhale. He lowered his body, his knees bending with a painful, audible creak of joints. He sank to the floor, moving with the same deliberate, unthreatening slowness. He went down on one knee, then the other, sinking into the soft soil. He rested his empty hands heavily on his thighs. He bowed his head, letting the dripping brim of his hat obscure his face. He offered her his neck. He offered her the silence. The long barrel of the Winchester remained pointed at him. The hammer remained cocked. The scent of wet earth and crushed leaves hung thick and heavy between them. He remained on his knees in the damp dirt. The adrenaline that had fueled his descent evaporated, leaving a hollow, aching void in his chest. His chin dropped toward his collarbone. Melted snow cascaded from the wide brim of his hat, pooling in the dark loam between his heavy leather boots. A violent tremor seized his shoulders, rattling his teeth together. The thaw had begun, bringing the excruciating fire of blood, forcing its way through half-dead veins and frozen capillaries. He let out a cough. It started deep in his chest, a wet, rattling hack that tore at his throat. He brought a shaking, leather-clad hand to his mouth, leaving a smear of dark mud across his graying stubble. The Winchester did not waver. The woman watched the violent shudders racking his large frame. She watched the puddle of meltwater widen around his knees. She recognized the rigid mechanical movements of a body shutting down. The heavy barrel of the rifle dipped an inch, then another. She did not lower the weapon completely. She took a slow, measured step backward, her boot heel sinking silently into the soft earth. She gestured with the iron front sight toward the center of the cavern. A massive pot-bellied cast-iron stove sat half-buried in a pit of river stones. Coal embers glowed a dull, angry red behind the iron grate, radiating a thick, dry heat that pushed back the dampness of the greenhouse. He raised his head. He gave a slow, minute nod. He planted his hands on his thighs and pushed upward. His knees popped a sharp, dry crack in the quiet room. He swayed his heavy boots, dragging through the dirt as he stumbled toward the heat. He reached the stove and collapsed onto an overturned apple crate. He reached for the bone buttons of his canvas duster. His fingers fumbled with the stiff fabric. It took him 3 attempts to work the buttons free. He shrugged the heavy coat off his shoulders. It hit the dirt floor with a wet, heavy slap. He smelled of wet wool, horse sweat, and freezing rain. He moved his hands to his waist. He grasped the heavy brass buckle of his gun belt. The woman stiffened. The rifle barrel rose a fraction, the stock pressing tight against her shoulder. He did not look at her. He unfastened the belt. He pulled the thick leather strap free, taking the heavy holster and the Colt revolver inside it. He placed the entire rig on the floor. He planted his boot against the leather and pushed. The gun slid across the damp earth, stopping 3 feet from her boots. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, extending his trembling bare hands toward the iron grate. She stared at the weapon in the dirt. Her eyes flicked back to his face, reading the deep lines carved by wind and exhaustion. She lowered the Winchester. She pressed her thumb against the hammer, squeezing the trigger to lower it with a sharp, definitive click. She stepped forward, keeping her eyes locked on his hunched shoulders. She crouched, scooping the heavy gun belt up with her free hand. She slung the belt over her shoulder, the Colt resting heavy against her back. The oppressive tension in the room fractured, leaving behind a heavy, watchful silence. He let the heat sear his palms. He turned his head, observing the space around him. It was a cathedral of dirt and timber. Heavy pine beams crisscrossed the low ceiling, holding back tons of frozen earth. Copper tubing, scavenged and hammered flat, ran along the wooden supports, dripping water directly onto the roots of the plants below. He saw rows of beans climbing up intricate trellises made of rusted wire and old wagon spokes. He saw tomato vines, thick and heavy, bound to wooden stakes with strips of faded calico cloth. The air was thick with the scent of respiration, a damp green breath that coated the back of his throat. He watched her move. She did not walk. She glided between the planters, her shoulders brushing the broad green leaves. She moved with a calculated economy of motion. Her eyes constantly scanned the shadows, checking the flickering hurricane lanterns, adjusting a polished tin reflector to catch the light. She kept her back away from the unlit corners. She stopped at a wooden barrel against the far dirt wall. She picked up a battered tin cup, dipped it into the barrel, and walked toward him. She stopped a full 5 paces away. She set the cup down on the edge of a wooden planter box. She stepped back, folding her arms across her chest, the rifle resting in the crook of her elbow. He looked at the cup. He looked at her hands. The sleeves of her patched woolen dress were rolled past her elbows. Her forearms were corded with lean muscle. A jagged, puckered scar tracked from her left wrist, disappearing under the coarse wool of her sleeve. It was an old burn, the skin glossy and twisted. A brand. He pushed himself up from the crate. He walked to the planter, picked up the cup, and returned to his seat. The water was cold, tasting heavily of limestone and dark soil. He drank it in 3 long swallows. "Obliged." His voice was a rasp of gravel tearing through his dry throat. She did not respond. She stared at the empty cup in his hands. "Storm," he said, staring into the glowing coals. "Caught me in the open." She shifted her weight. Her thumb brushed the scarred walnut of the rifle stock. "Nobody rides the ridge in December." Her voice was low. It cracked slightly, carrying the rust of long disuse. "Nobody with a choice." He set the tin cup on the dirt beside his boot. He leaned back against a thick timber support post. The warmth of the stove was a physical weight pressing him down into the crate. His eyelids fluttered heavy as lead. He looked up at the dirt ceiling. He listened to the faint, distant hiss of the water dripping from the copper pipes. He listened to the low whistle of the wind, muffled by 10 feet of solid earth. It was a fragile Eden. A single frozen pipe, a collapse of the timber shoring, or the wrong man falling through the trap door would end it all. She had built a fortress of green life in a graveyard of white. He closed his eyes. The heat wrapped around him. The rhythmic drip of the water pulled him down. For the first time in 5 days, his hand did not rest on iron. The iron stove radiated a dry, punishing heat. It baked the damp chill from his bones, turning the moisture in his heavy canvas duster into a slow, rising steam. The scent of wet wool, horse sweat, and stale tobacco mixed with the heavy, organic musk of the greenhouse. He sat hunched on the apple crate, his forearms resting on his knees, his chin tucked low. His eyes were closed. His breathing leveled into a slow, rhythmic pull, a mechanical function, taking over as his body shut down to repair the damage of the white hell above. Across the cavern, the woman worked. She moved through the narrow dirt aisles with practiced precision. Her calloused fingers pinched dead leaves from tomato vines, snapping the stems with a crisp, wet sound. She poured water from a battered tin can, the liquid pattering softly against the dark, thirsty loam. She did not look at him. She kept the Winchester slung across her back, the heavy barrel catching the amber lantern light with every turn of her shoulders. The silence of the underground sanctuary was deep layered with the microscopic sounds of life. The rustle of dry corn husks, the hiss of water turning to steam against the hot iron of the stove, the low, muted hum of the blizzard pressing against the earth 10 feet above. Then the hum changed. It started as a subtle shift in the air pressure, a heavy settling of the earth. A thin stream of dry dirt trickled from the thick pine shoring timbers of the ceiling, pattering against the brim of his hat. His eyes snapped open. The transition from near sleep to absolute wakefulness was instantaneous. No grogginess, no confusion. Only the cold, sharp clarity of a predator sensing a shift in the wind. He did not move his body. He kept his breathing slow and even. He shifted his gaze upward, staring at the planks above the ladder. Another stream of dirt fell, a heavy, muffled impact, vibrated through the wood. It was not the wind tearing at a loose board. It was the deliberate, crushing weight of a leather boot wrapped in iron spurs, stepping onto the wooden planks of the trapdoor. The woman froze. The tin watering can slipped a fraction of an inch in her grip. Water spilled over the rim, splashing onto her boots. She did not notice. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide, staring at the timbered ceiling. Her throat swallowed dryly. A harsh grating noise echoed down the vertical shaft. Metal dragging across frozen wood. Someone was clearing the ice from the iron ring. A muffled voice bled through the planks. The words were unintelligible, distorted by the wind and the earth, but the tone was sharp, commanding. A second voice answered, lower, punctuated by a guttural, barking laugh. The cowboy sat up straight. His joints popped a dry, cracking protest against the sudden movement. He calculated the variables. The gelding. The horse had reached its limit, its hooves split and bleeding from the jagged ice. He had left a trail. The storm had not buried it in time. The wolves had caught the scent. A high-pitched, ragged scream pierced the heavy dirt ceiling. It was the gelding. The sound held raw, unadulterated pain. A flat, heavy crack followed. It was a gunshot swallowed almost instantly by the howling wind, but unmistakable in its finality. The gelding's scream cut off. A heavy dead weight slammed against the frozen ground above, sending a tremor down the dirt walls. Then silence returned, heavier and darker than before. The cowboy stood. He moved away from the heat of the stove, stepping out of the amber light and into the shadows bordering the rows of corn. His boots made no sound on the damp soil. He kept his eyes locked on the ceiling. More footsteps. 3 distinct sets. They were circling the trapdoor, testing the edges, assessing the breach. The heavy wooden planks groaned under their combined weight. He looked across the room. The woman had dropped the watering can. It lay on its side, water pooling around a cluster of young bean sprouts. Her hands were on the Winchester. She unslung it from her back, bringing the stock to her shoulder with a fluid, practiced motion. Her thumb rested over the hammer. She pointed the barrel toward the dark opening of the shaft. Her jaw was clamped tight, a hard ridge of muscle standing out beneath her pale skin. Her chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow increments. He stepped into her line of sight. She flinched, the barrel of the rifle swinging a fraction of an inch toward his chest before she arrested the movement. He did not speak. He raised his right hand, keeping his palm open, and pointed a single thick finger at the heavy leather gun belt resting over her shoulder. The holster holding his Colt hung near her waist. She stared at him. The amber light caught the hard lines of his face, the gray stubble on his jaw, the absolute stillness in his eyes. There was no plea in his posture. There was only a cold, unavoidable fact. The world above had found her sanctuary. A heavy metallic clang rang out from the shaft. The rusted iron ring of the trapdoor hit the wooden planks. They had found the handle. He took a slow step forward. He kept his hand extended, his palm waiting. He did not break eye contact. He listened to the groan of the wood above as they pulled against the frozen hinges. She looked at his empty hand. She looked at the dark shaft. The scar on her forearm pulled tight as she shifted her grip on the Winchester. The hinges above let out a sharp, agonizing shriek. Dust rained down in thick sheets, coating the green leaves below. The trapdoor shifted. A crack of absolute blackness appeared at the top of the shaft. A jagged sliver of freezing wind sliced down into the cavern. It hit the warm, humid air of the greenhouse, instantly creating a swirling mist. The tomato vines shuddered. The temperature in the room plummeted. The scent of pine and burning coal was swept away, replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of ice and fresh blood. She lowered the Winchester with one hand. With the other, she grabbed the heavy leather gun belt. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and pressed the heavy leather into his open palm. His fingers closed over the rough, worn belt. He felt the cold steel of the Colt resting heavy in its holster. He gave a single, microscopic nod. He turned his back to her. He wrapped the belt around his waist, sliding the heavy brass buckle into place with a dull click. He drew the Colt. He checked the cylinder, the metallic spins sharp and clear in the quiet room. He snapped it shut. He raised the heavy revolver, resting the barrel against his right thigh, and waited in the shifting mist. The crack in the ceiling widened. A blade of white sub-zero wind sliced down the narrow dirt shaft. It hit the heavy, humid air of the greenhouse. A thick, swirling fog materialized instantly, rolling over the top rungs of the pine ladder and tumbling toward the floor. The amber light from the hurricane lanterns caught the mist, turning it into a slow-moving golden smoke. The scent of bruised tomato leaves and damp loam fractured. The sharp metallic odor of ice and fresh blood spilled into the cavern. Above, heavy boots scraped against the frozen planks. A muffled curse vibrated through the timber. The trapdoor was heavy, its hinges choked with years of rust and a fresh layer of solid ice. They were prying at it. The wood groaned under the leverage of steel tools. He stepped back into the shadows. He moved away from the base of the ladder, finding the darkest corner between a towering wall of cornstalks and the damp earth wall. The soft loam absorbed the sound of his boots. He lifted the heavy Colt. He pressed the release catch. The cylinder swung out with a smooth, oiled glide. He turned the weapon upward. He pressed the ejector rod. 6 heavy brass cartridges slid from the chambers, dropping into his awaiting left palm. The metal was cold. He holstered the empty gun. He brought his hands up, holding the bullets close to his chest. He picked one up between his thumb and forefinger. He inspected the lead tip. A thin film of condensation and fine dust coated the metal. He rubbed his thumb hard across the lead, polishing it clean. He checked the brass casing for dents. He checked the copper primer. He placed the clean cartridge between his teeth. He picked up the next one. He repeated the process. He worked with methodical, mechanical precision. The impending violence above did not hasten his movements. He wiped the dirt. He checked the primer. The only sounds in his corner were the rhythmic scrape of calloused skin against brass and his slow, even breathing. Across the room, the woman backed away. She retreated from the swirling mist at the base of the shaft. She moved backward down the narrow dirt aisle, her boots dragging slightly. She stopped in front of a long, shallow wooden box resting on a waist-high trestle. Inside the box, rows of pale green seedlings pushed through the dark soil. They were fragile. Their stems were thin as thread, their leaves no larger than fingernails. She turned her back to the ladder. She faced the seedlings. She placed the heavy stock of the Winchester on the floor, leaning the barrel against her hip. She spread her arms wide, gripping the edges of the wooden box. She hunched her shoulders, leaning over the young plants, turning her own body into a shield of patched wool and bone. She stared down at the green shoots. Her chest rose and fell in deep, ragged pulls. The cold air was spreading, biting at her exposed forearms. The scar on her wrist pulled tight, a stark white line against her flushed skin. He finished wiping the 6th cartridge. He drew the Colt. He fed the heavy brass rounds back into the steel cylinder one by one. The metallic clicks were sharp, precise intervals in the heavy air. Click, click, click. He snapped the cylinder shut. The sound was a harsh crack cutting through the low groan of the wood above. He thumbed the hammer back. A double click. The heavy iron locked into place. He lowered the weapon to his side. He stepped out of the shadows. He walked slowly down the aisle, moving past the thick tomato vines and the climbing beans. He stopped 10 feet from the woman. She did not turn around. Her knuckles were white against the edge of the planter box. He looked at her rigid spine. He looked at the frail green life she was covering. He looked up at the ceiling. The gap in the trapdoor was wider now. Snowflakes tumbled down the shaft, melting before they hit the dirt floor. The hinges screamed again, a high, tearing sound of metal giving way. Back corner. His voice was a low rumble of gravel. It barely carried over the noise above. She kept her head down. Her fingers dug into the wood. Take the lantern. Get behind the water barrels. Stay low. She turned her head. She looked over her shoulder. The golden light caught the hard lines of his face. His eyes were flat, empty of anything resembling warmth or hesitation. He was a creature built for the wasteland above, standing in the middle of her garden. He raised the Colt slightly. He pointed the dark bore toward the base of the ladder. They come down. He said the words slow and deliberate. They don't get past me. You hold your fire unless I fall. She looked at the heavy iron in his hand. She looked at the blood drying on his knuckles. She understood the transaction. He was bringing the rot of the outside world into her earth, but he was offering to be the wall that stopped it from spreading. She gave a single sharp nod. She scooped up the Winchester. She grabbed the handle of the nearest hurricane lantern. She did not look back. She moved swiftly down the aisle, disappearing behind a stack of heavy oak water barrels near the far wall. The light went with her, leaving the base of the ladder draped in thick, shifting shadows. He turned back to the shaft. He rolled his shoulders, feeling the heavy canvas duster settle against his back. He widened his stance, his boots sinking deep into the soft loam. He raised the Colt, leveling the barrel at the exact center of the descending darkness. A violent crack echoed through the cavern. The iron hinges sheared. The heavy wooden trapdoor was ripped open. The white hell poured in. The white hell did not just enter, it cascaded. The shearing of the iron hinges released a vertical avalanche of pulverized ice and freezing wind. It poured down the narrow dirt shaft, a roaring physical column of winter that collided violently with the stagnant, humid air of the underground farm. The collision spawned a dense, swirling fog. It rolled off the bottom rungs of the ladder, creeping across the damp loam, wrapping around the thick stalks of corn and the heavy tomato vines. The temperature in the cavern plummeted. The tender green leaves nearest the shaft shivered, their edges curling inward as the frost bit into their delicate veins. The heavy scent of wet earth and respiration vanished, replaced entirely by the razor-sharp stench of ozone and raw ice. He stood perfectly still in the shifting mist. His boots were rooted in the soft dirt. He breathed through his nose, long, controlled pulls that drew the freezing air deep into his lungs. The heavy Colt rested at his hip, the barrel angled slightly upward, tracking the dark opening above. A shadow eclipsed the pale gray light at the top of the shaft. A heavy snow-caked leather boot scraped blindly against the top rung of the pine ladder. A rusted iron spur clinked against the wood. The ladder groaned a deep, protesting creak that echoed through the earthen chamber. Another boot found the second rung. Then the heavy drape of a buffalo hide coat descended into the shaft. The man climbed down backward. He moved with the clumsy, rushing arrogance of a predator who believed he had cornered wounded prey. He did not check his flanks. He did not look down. He only sought to escape the biting wind above and claim whatever warmth lay below. A second set of boots appeared at the lip of the hole, waiting for the first man to clear the way. The cowboy did not shift his weight. He did not tighten his grip on the smooth walnut of the revolver. He let the first man descend. He counted the rungs by the rhythmic heavy thuds of the leather boots. 6, 7, 8. The man reached the bottom. His boots hit the soft loam with a heavy, wet crunch. He let go of the ladder, turning around to face the cavern. He was a massive shape in the gloom, his face entirely obscured by a thick scarf and the pulled-down brim of a bowler hat. He reached into his heavy coat, pulling a short-barreled shotgun from the deep pocket. He took one step forward, stepping out of the direct downdraft of the storm and into the swirling fog of the greenhouse. He stopped. He raised his head, smelling the air. The lingering scent of the iron stove, the damp soil. Through the mist, he saw the amber glow of the hurricane lantern hidden behind the oak water barrels at the far end of the room. He racked the pump of the shotgun. The sharp mechanical clack was deafening in the enclosed space. He never took the second step. The cowboy raised the Colt. He did not aim down the sights. He pointed the heavy barrel as an extension of his own arm, relying on muscle memory forged in 100 dark alleys and blind canyons. His thumb slipped off the hammer. The firing pin struck the brass primer. The explosion in the subterranean room was catastrophic. The concussive wave of the .45 caliber round tore through the humid air, flattening the nearby cornstalks. A blinding, jagged spear of yellow flame erupted from the muzzle, illuminating the cavern in a harsh, stroboscopic flash. The heavy lead slug took the intruder dead center in the chest. The impact lifted him off his feet, snapping his spine backward. The shotgun discharged into the dirt roof as he fell, sending a shower of loose soil and splintered pine raining down into the fog. The man hit the ground hard, his heavy buffalo coat absorbing the blood pooling out into the dark loam. The roar of the gunshot bounced off the dirt walls, a physical pressure that hammered against the eardrums. Acrid white sulfur smoke billowed from the barrel of the Colt, thickening the icy fog. Above on the ladder, the second man froze. For a fraction of a second, the shock of the violent noise paralyzed him. The cowboy did not hesitate. The recoil of the first shot had barely settled his arm before his thumb found the hammer again. He pulled it back, the cylinder rotating with a sharp metallic click, locking the next round into the chamber. He adjusted his aim upward, firing blindly through the wooden rungs of the ladder. The second shot roared. The muzzle flash painted the descending shaft in stark skeletal shadows. The bullet shattered the heavy pine rung just below the second man's boots. Sharp splinters of wood exploded outward. A ragged shout echoed down the hole. The man lost his footing. He plummeted the remaining 10 feet, crashing heavily through the wooden framing of a climbing bean trellis. Rusted wire snapped. Dry vines tore. He hit the floor, rolling, thrashing wildly in the tangle of broken wood and crushed greenery. He came up on one knee, a heavy service revolver in his hand, firing blindly into the thick, smoke-filled mist. The return fire was frantic, undisciplined. A bullet ripped through the air inches from the cowboy's ear, burying itself deep into the dirt wall with a dull thwack. Another round clipped the heavy wire supporting the main tomato vines. The wire snapped. The entire row collapsed. Fat, heavy tomatoes hit the floor. The soft red fruit burst under the impact, splattering acidic juice and pale seeds across the dark earth. The sharp, metallic stench of burnt cordite rolled through the room, violently weaving itself into the sweet, pungent smell of the crushed tomatoes and the raw iron scent of the dead man's blood. The fragile Aiden was tearing itself apart. The cowboy stepped sideways. He moved off the path, his boots crushing through the fallen vines, turning the ripe fruit into a slick, red paste. He moved silently through the smoke, flanking the thrashing man in the broken trellis. He stopped. He saw the dark outline of the man, kneeling in the ruins of the beans, frantically cocking his revolver for another blind shot. The cowboy raised his arm. He aligned the iron sights with the dark mass of the man's shoulder. He squeezed the trigger. The third shot cracked like a whip. The man in the vines pitched forward his gun, discharging uselessly into the dirt, severing a copper water pipe. Cold water sprayed wildly into the air, hissing as it hit the hot barrel of the dropped gun. The cavern fell completely silent, save for the howling wind above and the steady, rhythmic drumming of the broken water pipe spraying over the dead. The thick white gunsmoke hung heavy in the freezing air, a suffocating shroud settling slowly over the ruined garden. He kept the Colt raised. He stared up the dark shaft. The wind screamed through the broken trapdoor, but no other boots appeared on the edge. He thumbed the hammer back, the double click, sharp and cold, and waited for the third man. The copper pipe continued to hiss. A fine, cold spray rained down over the crushed tomato vines and the motionless bodies. The thick white smoke from the Colt hung low, trapped by the heavy dirt ceiling, weaving a blinding shroud over the narrow aisles. He waited. He kept the heavy barrel of the revolver pointed up at the ragged square of pale, freezing light. His breathing was a slow, controlled rasp. The cold from the open shaft was absolute, a heavy sinking tide that froze the sweat on his forehead. The third man did not climb down. The silence stretched, broken only by the spitting water and the howl of the storm above. It was a calculated silence. The man above was not a panicked amateur. He was waiting for the smoke to clear. He was waiting for a cough, a shift in footing, a scrape of leather against wood. The cowboy lowered the Colt an inch. His thumb rested heavy on the hammer. He stepped sideways, moving his right boot slowly through the slick red paste of the ruined fruit. He needed a new angle. He needed the shadow of the thick timber shoring. His boot heel caught the edge of a splintered planter box. It was a microscopic sound, a dull wooden click. The square of light above vanished. A massive, heavy object plummeted down the shaft. It did not use the ladder. It fell in a straight, dead drop. The cowboy tracked the falling mass. He did not fire. The shape was too loose, too limp. It was a frozen canvas saddlebag packed tight with gear. It slammed into the dirt floor, sending a shockwave through the loam. A split second later, the third man dropped. He came down fast, sliding down the side of the shaft, his heavy leather coat scraping against the frozen dirt walls. He hit the ground directly behind the fallen saddlebag, using it as a barrier. He hit the dirt, rolling a heavy, compact shape of dark wool and iron. He came up fast. A short-barreled scattergun swept through the smoke. The cowboy raised the Colt. The cavern erupted in a blinding, concussive roar. Both weapons fired in the exact same fraction of a second. The heavy lead ball from the Colt took the third man in the meat of his right thigh, tearing through the heavy canvas pants and shattering bone. The man's leg gave way, folding under him with a sickening crunch, but the scattergun had already discharged. A wall of double-aught buckshot tore through the swirling fog. The heavy lead pellets shredded the remaining tomato vines, snapping the thick wooden stakes like dry twigs. The cowboy felt a massive blunt impact on his left side. It was not a sharp pain. It felt as though he had been struck by a swinging anvil. The kinetic force lifted his boots completely off the ground. He spun backward, the heavy canvas duster twisting around his legs. He crashed into a tall, tiered rack of root vegetables. The heavy pine shelves collapsed under his weight. Clay pots shattered. Dark, rich potting soil cascaded over him, burying his legs and waist. He lay in the ruins. The air was entirely knocked from his lungs. The cavern spun. A high, thin ringing noise drowned out the hiss of the water pipe. He looked down at his left side. The heavy canvas coat was torn, a jagged smoking hole just below his ribcage. A dark, wet stain was spreading rapidly across the pale fabric, turning it a deep, slick black. The heat of his own blood was a stark contrast to the freezing wind pouring down the shaft. He drew in a ragged, agonizing breath. A white-hot spike of pure fire drove through his torso. He tasted copper. Through the thick smoke, a heavy dragging sound reached his ears. The third man was not dead. He was pulling himself across the damp earth, leaving a wide, dark smear of blood in his wake. He had dropped the scattergun. He held a long, bone-handled hunting knife in his fist. His breathing was a wet, bubbling growl. He dragged himself toward the ruined vegetable rack, his eyes fixed on the cowboy. The cowboy pushed his right hand into the loose soil. He found the cold, checkered walnut grip of the Colt. He had dropped it during the fall. He wrapped his fingers around the heavy iron. His left arm was entirely numb, a dead weight pinned beneath a collapsed pine board. He used his boots to push backwards, sliding deeper into the pile of dirt and broken clay. The third man lunged. He pushed off his one good leg, launching his upper body forward. He brought the heavy blade down in a brutal, sweeping arc. The cowboy rolled his shoulders hard to the right. The hunting knife drove deep into the dirt floor, burying itself to the hilt exactly where his neck had been a second before. The momentum carried the third man forward. His heavy, sweat-soaked torso crashed directly onto the cowboy's chest. The impact drove another blinding spike of agony through the gunshot wound. The smell of the man was overwhelming. Rancid grease, stale whiskey, unwashed wool, and the sharp metallic stench of panic. The man let go of the buried knife. He brought both of his heavy, dirt-caked hands up, reaching for the cowboy's throat. His thick fingers dug into the wool scarf, pressing down against the windpipe. The cowboy did not thrash. He did not waste his fading oxygen on a struggle. He let his head fall back into the damp loam. He kept his right arm pinned tight against his side. He bent his wrist upward. He brought the short barrel of the Colt up from the dirt. He pressed the cold steel muzzle directly into the heavy wool of the man's coat, right under the ribcage. He pulled the trigger. The shot was muffled. The heavy buffalo coat absorbed the flash and the sound, turning the sharp crack into a deep, wet thud. The man on top of him went entirely rigid. His eyes went wide, staring blankly at the dark timber ceiling. The grip on the cowboy's throat loosened. The heavy hands fell away, dropping limply into the soil. The man exhaled one last time, a long, rattling breath that smelled of copper and bad teeth. His massive weight collapsed, pressing the cowboy deeper into the earth. The cowboy lay still beneath the dead man. His breathing was shallow, a strained, rhythmic wheeze. He stared up at the swirling mist, watching the snow fall through the broken trapdoor. Beneath his back, the dark, thirsty loam drank the blood of 3 men. It soaked deep into the soil, finding the severed roots of the broken vines, feeding the earth with iron and heat. The fragile Eden was gone. It was just a grave now waiting for the winter to seal it shut. The weight of the dead man pressed him deep into the dark loam. It was a crushing burden of wet buffalo hide, stale sweat, and rapidly cooling flesh. The cowboy lay beneath it for a long minute. He listened to the severed copper pipe spitting water into the ruined soil. He listened to the ragged, shallow pull of his own lungs. The howling of the storm above had lost its sharp edge, settling into a low, hollow moan. The blizzard was breaking. He wedged his right boot against the dirt floor, finding purchase against a shattered clay pot. He brought his right hand up, planting the palm against the dead man's thick shoulder. He closed his eyes. He shoved. The effort sent a blinding white flare of agony tearing through his left side. His jaw locked. A low, guttural grate of sound vibrated in his throat. The massive corpse rolled off him, hitting the damp earth with a heavy, wet slap. The cowboy rolled onto his right hip. He pushed himself up onto his knees. The movement was slow, mechanical, a sheer triumph of will over failing muscle. He looked down at his left side. The thick canvas duster was saturated a dark, heavy slick of crimson, spreading outward from the ragged tear over his ribs. He unbuttoned the coat with shaking, dirt-caked fingers. He pulled the fabric aside. A single buckshot pellet had gouged a deep, ugly furrow along his lower ribs, tearing through muscle but glancing off the bone. It was bleeding heavily, mixing with the dark soil clinging to his shirt. A soft scrape of leather against dirt pulled his gaze upward. The woman stepped out from the deep shadows of the oak water barrels. She carried the hurricane lantern in her left hand. The Winchester hung by its strap from her right shoulder. She walked down the center aisle, moving slowly through the devastation. She stepped over the severed vines, the crushed tomatoes, and the splintered pine stakes. She walked past the body of the first man, then the second. She did not flinch. Her face was a mask of pale, hard stone drawn tight in the amber light. She stopped in front of him. She looked down at the bleeding furrow on his side. She set the lantern on an unbroken section of the wooden planter box. She knelt in the dirt. She set the rifle down. Without a word, she reached down to the hem of her faded woolen dress. She gripped the fabric and pulled upward, exposing a layer of clean white cotton underskirt. She took the bone-handled knife she had retrieved from her apron pocket and sliced a long, wide strip of the white cloth. She leaned forward. Her hands smelled of bruised tomato leaves and lye soap. She pressed the thick wad of cotton directly against the open wound. The cowboy's breath hissed sharply through his teeth. His head snapped back, the muscles in his neck standing out like thick cords. He did not pull away. He endured the burning pressure. She wrapped the remaining length of the cotton strip around his torso, pulling it brutally tight to stem the blood flow. She tied a hard, flat knot over his lower back. She did not offer gentle words. She offered survival. She sat back on her heels. Her hands were stained with his blood. She wiped them slowly on her dark canvas apron. The cowboy looked around the cavern. The copper pipe had finally emptied itself, leaving only a slow, rhythmic drip. The thick white smoke from the gunfire had thinned, creeping upward to escape through the shattered trapdoor. The air was brutally cold, now the warmth of the iron stove entirely defeated by the open shaft. The fragile Eden was heavily scarred, its green life buried under splinters, dirt, and iron. But the roots remained intact beneath the soil. He planted his right hand on the planter box and forced himself to stand. The cavern tilted, a wave of dark dizziness washing over him. He locked his knees, waiting for the ground to stabilize. He looked down at the dirt. His battered, wide-brimmed hat lay half-buried near the dead man's boots. He bent down a slow, agonizing descent and picked it up. He slapped it against his thigh, knocking the wet loam from the felt. He placed it on his head, pulling the brim low over his eyes. He looked at the woman. She remained kneeling in the ruins of her garden, looking up at him. He gave a single microscopic nod. A transaction completed. An unspoken debt settled in blood and soil. He turned his back to her. He walked toward the base of the ladder, his boots heavy, his left arm held rigid against his side. The freezing wind kissed his face, carrying the scent of fresh snow and empty plains. He reached up, grasping the first intact wooden rung. He began the slow, agonizing climb toward the ragged square of pale, grayish-blue light above. The dawn was breaking over the white hell. The storm always passes, but the blood left in the soil remains. He rode back into the white void, leaving behind a fragile garden that will now bloom from the violence he planted. Welcome to Iron Resolve Tales. We just watched a man who had walked away from the world be forced to become its monster once more, just to keep a single patch of green alive. It leaves a heavy question hanging in the freezing air. When a man commits brutal, unrelenting violence to shield the innocent, does that make him an instrument of justice? Or just another killer waiting for the snow to cover his tracks? Where do you draw the line between necessary ruthlessness and losing the last shred of your own soul? Let me know your thoughts down in the dust of the comments section. If this quiet walk through the dark resonated with you, leave a like. Subscribe to the channel. There are more broken trails to ride, more storms to weather, and more tales of silent grit waiting ahead. Stay resolute.